Hey everybody, again, if I haven't met you yet, my name is DJ Tripoli. I'll be your instructor for this class. I'm going to do something a little different that I haven't done with my previous semesters with this class. And what I'm going to try to do and be more helpful from the feedback that I've gotten from students is basically give you video lectures to go along with all the information. So before I had just posted the lectures and had you guys kind of read through them. So I'm going to do my best to give you a little bit more information, and it might not be as in-depth as all the slides say, but I do want to make sure that I'm presentable a little more to you in this. So hopefully that works out and helps you out as we kind of gain access to all this stuff. So I'm going to jump right in. We have chapter 1 and chapter 2 today, or I'll try to get it all done in this video. So we'll see what happens. So let me share my screen and then we'll get going. So again, my big thing is just getting most of this info out to you as best as I can with everything. So we're looking kind of at the foundational stuff. So structure and function of the muscles, the nervous system, the skeletal system. So it's pretty sciencey. It's got a lot of physiology in it and anatomy in it, but really important, especially if you're going to be a personal trainer. This is the why, this is the how that I think is very important for us as personal trainers or professionals in this field or whatever, is to have this understanding better than most is kind of the idea behind it. So the muscular system, different types of muscles. You have smooth, which would be something like in your GI tract, so your gastrointestinal. So think like your intestines, like that movement through the esophagus, things like that. You have cardiac, so your heart, which is a muscle, which is just made a little bit differently. It's got different types of cells. And then the big one we know is skeletal. This is the one that attaches the bones and allows for movement. And then structure dictates its function. So that's why the GI tract acts the way it does, why the heart acts the way it does. And then obviously our muscles in their way and different joint or muscle angles and things like that called pennation. So just kind of keep that in mind throughout this whole thing, is structure and function seem to go hand in hand. You don't need to know all the muscles as far as I understand it. You need to know the major ones when we get to the exercise selection and picking exercises. When you start talking about things like lower body, upper body, pectoralis major, the big muscles like that, you do need to have a general understanding of. But again, I'm not going to quiz you on the anatomy of everything. Gross skeletal anatomy. So if you take the muscle, so on the far right, the big bundle, then you can really start to break it down into individual groupings. So that's going to be your fascicle, is your surrounded by a paramecium. So that's your second level of that. So a group of fibers. Then you've got your sarcolemma, or excuse me, your sarcoplasm within all of your cells. So if you look down here, so again, whole muscle, but then that can get broken down into a fascicle. That can get broken down even more. And then we're into a single muscle cell made up of myofilaments, and kind of looking at how a muscle contracts. And we'll see that too. The epimecium, the perimecium, and the endomecium, those are the tissues that cover, or the fascia that covers those level of muscle. So you can see the epi is around the whole muscle. So they use this little white kind of here. Then you've got your endomecium, which is between the muscle fibers. And then you have, your paramecium, which is around the whole thing. And then your endomecium, which is around the individual fibers that we have here. So again, just understanding the muscle is a lot of little fibers that all contract together and generate all of that force that we're trying to get to. So it's not just this big clump of a giant cell. It's a lot of little ones. And that'll be important when we start talking about the all or none principle and things like that. Going a little smaller. So now we're all the way down kind of to the single tube. So how does it all happen? So again, the sarcolemma, plasma membrane surrounding each muscle fiber cell. So think like cytoplasm type of stuff. Just talking about the muscle. It regulates the movement of materials in and out of the cell. So like action potentials, that's going to be the signal, the electrical signal that causes the muscle to contract, or trying to tell the muscle to contract. They are multinucleated. That just means they have multiple nuclei, which contain DNA, which are important for genetic changes like developing muscle, building proteins, things like that. Mitochondria are also in there, which are going to be important. They use little purple ones here. Again, the powerhouse of the cell, energy, depending on the type of muscle fiber or the type of muscle, how much or how little of that mitochondria is there. Your training adaptation. So you can train a muscle to develop and build more mitochondria because it's going to be more aerobically based potentially. So again, that's a function that we do as trainers and as health professionals. And then you have the sarcoplasmic reticulum. These are the yellow tubes right here that carry calcium, and that's going to regulate the muscle contraction process. And again, we'll see that in a second. But again, there's a lot. And I'm telling you, take time with this, read your textbook to kind of get a really good understanding of what's happening physiologically all the way down to the individual fibers. It's important. You maybe never have to explain it to a client or anything like that, but you need to understand what you're adapting or why it's functioning the way that it is. Again, an individual myofibril is a bundle of myofilaments. And then those myofilaments, myosin, which is what we're going to call the thick one. It has things called like a head, a neck, and a tail. Then you have the actin, which is the thin one, and that contains tropomyosin and troponin. Just important to remember, troponin and calcium. So when that calcium gets released from what we just saw, those yellow tubules, it moves the tropomyosin away. Tropomyosin moves away from that site, and that allows for the actin and myosin to attach. So that's kind of the understanding there. There's a video in here, I believe, that explains that really well to also look at. So again, if we look at the picture, right, we're breaking down from whole muscle into these individual fibers, and you see all of this going on. So within that little section, that sarcomere is where you're going to have contractions going on, contractions and relaxations. And then if you look at, you've got your myosin. So this is your thick piece. So you got your heads and your tails. The tropomyosin is on here as well, but you have your actin, which is your green fiber. And so depending on the whole function, you're going to basically have these heads and tails pulling the actin together or closer together. And that's going to give you that shortening, right, of that muscle right there. Again, close-up view of just all of that. Again, a sarcomere. So this is the basic unit of a muscle. So if you think, think like cell is the basic unit of life. A sarcomere is a basic unit of a muscle. We call that Z line to Z line. So that would be, in this case, that would be this line there to that line there would be one sarcomere, okay? And then just some things to know. So the A band, so this blue band right here, is the width of the myosin. So the myosin are the thick parts again. So they're going to be in this range right here, okay? The H zone is myosin, no actin. So that's this middle part right here. So you can see where there's less crossover. There's no green with our colors that we're using, right? So that's the range that we have to move potentially. The M line aligns the myosin. So you can see, again, that midline, right, aligns all the myosin. And then the I band is between two sarcomeres, and that is the only actin. So the I band, again, is right here. So again, just knowing your areas, knowing what's contained in each one, that's about the basics, at least from my understanding, what you need to know for my class. Again, if you're in a physiology class or you're in exercise phys or something like that, you might need to know more. But again, just kind of understanding where those are and being able to locate those is important because you need to know where that movement's going to come from. At the junction, so at the, we'll call this NJ, you have the nerve ending that comes all the way up to that individual muscle fiber. So that's this first picture, okay, right here. This is where it's going to receive its stimulus. So you have the axon, which is the ending, okay? So the axon terminal is this area right here. Then you have your motor end plate, and then you have your synaptic cleft. So the cleft is just the opening, right, that's going through right here. And then the pink or the reddish area, that's your muscle fiber. So chemicals are going to be sent, right, into the muscle fiber, specifically calcium. So we can see the calcium that's coming in or being released, excuse me, right? Then that's going to affect the tropomyosin and the troponin, which is then going to open up the actin, which is going to allow the myosin heads to attach and then start pulling. And so again, you're seeing all the way from the very beginning to kind of how we get to an actual muscle contraction. Again, are you explaining this to your, 65-year-old client? Probably not, but you need to understand it in case they ask you too, like, how does this all work or why is it not working and things like that. All right. So the sliding filament theory, this is kind of what I've just been saying for the last little bit. So I try to break it down in steps. I think your book does a pretty good job of it as well. But please go watch videos on this. You can Google it. You can YouTube it. They have great animations of these things. So I'll kind of read through these. So an action potential passes along the neuron. So that's your electrical signal. It leads to the release of something called acetylcholine at that NJ. So that junction between the nerve and the cell or the muscle cell. That acetylcholine binds to the receptors on the motor end plate. So the end of the muscle fiber. That leads the action potential along the sarcolemma. So we're inside the muscle cell. The action potential will move inside of the fiber via the T tubules. That's part of that yellow system. Those those yellow with the calcium in it. And then the calcium migrates and binds to troponin, which is located on the actin filament. So again, we're not done yet, but that's where we're getting to. Again, we're moving into the individual parts of the fiber. Tropomyosin moves, that exposes the sites for the myosin head. So think tropomyosin, and then myosin is going to attach where those were. They get energized. So think ATP, if you've heard that term before. They're able to attach and form cross-bridging, and then they will attempt to pull the action towards the center, again, towards the center of the sarcomere. Now, after it's pulled, myosin is no longer, or it's in a low energy state. ATP must bind to the myosin head so it can detach. So when it contracts, it needs more energy so it can release itself and then reattach and then shorten again. So it needs energy to do that. Hence why we start talking about things like fatigue and those sorts of things. Myosin head may form a cross bridge if binding sites are still exposed. So if those stay exposed, myosin might attach still. So just something to think about there. Okay, good. So this is a video you guys can watch. You guys can watch that on your own time. But I think it does do a pretty good job of explaining the sliding filament, and you've got all types of resources that can do this for you. Hopefully, if there's any questions on this, again, after I post it, you guys can post comments in the video. I'll put it on a page, and hopefully that'll work for you. Types of muscle actions. So you might have heard these before, you might not have. You can use any of them in training, which is great depending on your clients. Muscles always attempt to shorten, but they can't always do that, right? We always think, I'll use my bicep again as an example, right? We're used to this movement right here, right? That shortening of the bicep, right? We're used to that one, but it doesn't always happen. And we've known that, we just may not know what the name of it was. So you have isometric, which is the first picture. That's where the muscle force and the resistance equal each other. So the muscle has to remain the same because it can't overcome the force. So if I put, let's say my bicep could create 50 pounds of force, and I'm holding a 50-pound weight, theoretically, I wouldn't have any movement there. So this picture would be an accurate depiction where there's no movement there. And we've done that before. You've probably done that before, or you've gotten stuck during a rep and you can't move anymore. That would be isometric, whether by choice or just because the amount of force you can apply is equal to the force that you're trying to move up, whether that's a weight, your body, whatever it is. Then you have concentric. That's the one we probably know most about. That's where the force is greater than the resistance and we're able to shorten our muscle. So if I finish that bicep curl here, okay. And then you have eccentric, which is where the muscle force is less than the resistance. So this one, you might hear this called like a negative rep or a elongation or something like that. But if you think about, if I hold, let's say I can't curl 60 pounds, okay, but I can get to 60 here and then I can control it on the way back down as it's lengthening. So the lengthening part of that bicep, that would be an eccentric because the resistance I'm holding, the 60 pounds, is greater than the force my muscle can generate. Okay. And so that's a different type of action that you can do. We use these a lot in like pull-ups, right? You jump up and then you try to control yourself for as long as you can on the way back down. That would be an eccentric movement where gravity is becoming greater than just your ability to hold yourself up. So just know there are different types of muscle actions. Know what each one does, whether it's no movement, shortening, or lengthening. And then when you start doing your own programming, try to include some of these different ones in and see what the difference is. Something I say with eccentric specifically, if you're trying, and this is a marketing kind of tool, I don't think you need to be sore after every workout to know it works. Clients like to feel that. If you do a lot of eccentric work your first or second session, hopefully you don't bury them into the ground, but they're going to be sore, especially if they haven't done that eccentric training before. That causes a lot of muscular damage, a lot of adaptation, but a lot of damage. So if you think soreness is going to be what brings them back, eccentric might be something to use. Now you got to be careful with what the capabilities are, but just something to think about. Again, all of this kind of goes in, but if you don't understand muscle actions, then you don't know why you're doing something. It's not going to be long-term for you. And that's a big thing for me is I want you to understand the why for everything that you're doing when it comes to programming, exercise, nutrition, all that stuff. So obviously if we were in person, which is what this class was originally, we'd have activities. But you just start thinking about the exercises you do and determine if it's concentric, isometric, or it's eccentric, and see if you can categorize those or how you can manipulate those to become a different one? How can a bicep curl become an eccentric bicep curl, right? Or an isometric, become a concentric and things like that? Or how can I mix them in? So just get those gears going a little bit. Here's that delayed onset muscle soreness. DOMS is what it's called a lot. Again, soreness resulting from connective and muscle tissue damage. Again, when you work out, you are causing damage to the muscle, right? Hopefully it's what I call micro damage and not severe damage, like tearing of a muscle, right? That like separation. But you are causing some damage. So that recovery process is where a lot of that soreness comes in. Again, you don't need to have DOMS in order for it to be a successful workout. But again, what that means a lot of the time is that whatever movement you did or the rep scheme you did, it was new to your body. So your body incurred more damage than maybe normal, even if you exercise all the time, because it was something your body's not used to. Again, adaptation, it's going to adapt to what stresses are put on it. So if you introduce a new stress, it's going to super compensate in that adaptation, which can lead to increased muscle soreness. So just kind of be aware of that. And I just talked about this as a PT. Again, you can sell soreness for a little bit. You don't want it all the time. And again, eccentric is going to tend to lead to greater amounts of DOMS. So just be careful when you're using it. If you have an athlete and they have a game coming up the next day, but they want to work out, maybe don't do eccentric movements so they're sore the next 24 to 48 hours, right? So just being mindful of those things kind of as you go into your programming and things like that. A couple different muscle fiber types. Not all muscle fibers are created equal. We typically have three. They've changed names a little bit. Type 1, type 2A, and type 2B. You might also see type 1, type 2A, and type 2X is the other ones. But again, so we're looking at some are peak force, so some are very high force production ones. Some are more aerobic, which means they like oxygen. Some are anaerobic, where they don't use oxygen or not as much. And then some are more resistant to fatigue, some to fatigue quicker. Again, and there's a chart in your book, I'm pretty sure, that explains it really well. And again, we're just looking at fatigue in this picture here. But again, so type 1, which are called slow twitch, low fatigue rate, which means you can go for longer amounts of time, right? Where type 2, think sprinters, right? They can't sprint the same speed they did for 100 meters for 800 meters, right? Or for 1600 meters for a mile. But a type 1 fiber, right, with the right intensity, you can run marathons, you can run super marathons, you can run 150 miles, those races and things like that. So depending on the muscle fiber that you're training or whatever your programming is going to affect the muscle fiber development. And so just understanding what you're working on and what your client has or wants to have is going to be important for you. Here's that comparison. Good to know this. Again, just understanding it. Again, type 1, and then you got muscle fiber size, the contraction speed, force, oxidative capacity. That would be like with oxygen, so long-term endurance. Glycolytic is going to be more high intensity, more force production. So you can see how those would kind of be where force and capacity are going to be correlated together. And then power. So again, type 1 is going to be less powerful, right? How much work can I do in a short amount of time? And then you got type 2B on the far side, where it's very high, right? Where I don't have a lot of oxidative capacity. So I'm going to fatigue faster, right? But I can generate more power if that's what I need to do. Okay. So depending on the sport, depending on your client's abilities, things like that, it's going to be very indicative of what type of training you do. The nervous system. So we're going to just connect it a little bit. Again, I'm more worried about the muscular system and the skeletal system, but again, we should understand this a little bit. Again, your muscles, other than even with a reflex, you still need your nervous system. So we can look at the motor cortex, and then just basic understanding of it getting sent through the spinal cord into your peripheral nerves and then into your muscle fibers is kind of just the main idea here. So just think brain's got to be involved in the process. Okay, your central nervous system and your peripheral nervous system. Those are kind of the two big categories that we'll use here. So your central nervous system, or CNS, is your brain and your spinal cord. Okay, and then your peripheral nervous system is everything else. And then you can kind of use this chart to decide what it's looking at. So some is sensory, some is motor. Motor would be like movement. You have autonomic and somatic. So autonomic would be involuntary. So think like heart beating, breathing, those types of things where you don't have to think about them. Otherwise we'd be dead. And then somatic is more under your control. So think more not automatic, your skeletal muscles, right? That is your choice to move them, so to speak. So again, just understanding the differences, categorizing them, because you're going to see these words, especially if you're continuing your education. So just make sure that we're able to understand and differentiate those. Again, a neuron is called or a nerve cell is called a neuron. So again, don't be freaked out by that terminology. Motor neuron is what, again, movement neuron. So neurons specific for helping muscles contract. Sensory neurons are what's going to look at things like tension and stretching, movement, pain. There are different types of neurons there. The synapse is just the gap where that communication occurs. So again, synaptic cleft we looked at. So this would be your synapse, right? That open space where things transfer in and out, basically from the nerve typically to the cell that it's about to innervate. Again, we're looking at muscle fibers specifically. So just again, knowing these vocab words and then how it applies is important. Neuron anatomy, again, this is a whole neuron. So imagine on the left side of the screen, if we had different muscle cells at this end piece over here, okay? So now we're looking kind of back on the other side of it. What is all connected to this? So you have dendrites over here on the top. Those are what's going to be receiving signals. So signals from other neurons. So again, this is a long chain of communication. The axon are the ends here that go into either another neuron or into your muscle cells. Is kind of where that goes into something else. So again, your muscle there, and that electrical signal literally, in this case, would literally hop from gap to gap all the way through this, and that increases the rate of sending that message. So the more efficient you are at sending that message, the quicker the muscles contract, and that's where you get performance outcomes that are different depending on the individual. Two sensory organs that are probably pretty big for us are the muscle spindles and then the Golgi tendon organs. They sound similar, but I need you to be able to understand the difference between the two. So muscle spindles, think stretch. Okay, so spindle, stretch. They are the stretch receptor. Okay, so they sense changes in muscle length. When stretched in a specific way, the stretch reflex occurs. So I think the easiest way to do this one is, so if you were laying down and someone was stretching your leg, right? They're pushing it towards your body. And so you're stretching the back of your leg, your hamstring. There's a certain point that you stop, right? Everyone stops at a different point. What is happening, hopefully, is that so that muscle is getting, this muscle spindle's feeling that hamstring lengthen. It's getting to the point where your body specifically is going, I can't go any farther safely. So what does it do? It causes that muscle to contract so that it doesn't go any farther. So you lifted it, you lifted it, you lifted it. It gets to about here and it goes, no, we can't go anymore. And that's why we stop. So that's why you may not be as flexible as you want to be, or mobile, or whatever term you want to use at this point. So that is your muscle spindles that do that, okay? The Golgi tendon organs, they sense muscle tension. So that would be with the force that's under it. So let's say you were under a squat rack and you were doing a barbell squat with heavy weight. And let's say your goal was 3 reps and you got to 2 reps and you're in the middle of the third and you're on your way up, but you just can't get it up. What's happening at that point is the force becomes too great, okay? It's superseding you. The Golgi tendon organ neurons go to the spinal cord. They tell the body to relax the working muscle and to activate the opposite muscle. So you might fail the set, but failing that set is your body trying to protect you, is kind of the idea behind that, right? So those Golgi tendon organs, they feel the amount of tension on you, on those muscles specifically, and they go, we can't overcome this. We're going to let this weight drop. We're not going to fight it and injure ourselves. Okay. So notice those two differences. One is force and one is stretch. Okay. So just be aware of those. So again, I think tendon, tension, spindle, stretch. So here's a motor unit. A motor unit, the definition is a motor neuron and the muscle fibers that it innervates. So again, you have this single neuron and then all of the, now it may not touch all of these muscle fibers, right? Some of them might be connected to another neuron. Just because they're close to each other doesn't mean that they're all activated by the same one. But all fibers in that motor unit are the same fiber type. So all type 1s are going to be are going to be attached in that one thing. You're not going to have type 2s and type 1s within the same motor neuron attachment. But again, the number of fibers can vary, the size of them, things like that. So just know that's what a motor unit is. So obviously, if this is all the only fibers that this neuron is connecting, you can imagine something like your bicep, right, needing a lot of motor units in order to contract together, right? We don't feel these like spasms when we contract, right? It seems really smooth. So we have a lot of communication going on between that neuron and all of the fibers in our bicep, for example, depending on the force that we're trying to lift. With gradation of force, so that's just like increasing in force, if you think about it that way, So motor unit recruitment. So again, motor units we just talked about. The nervous system varies the number of motor units or fibers that are activated. So if you don't need to activate all of your muscle fibers, it won't activate them all. So let's say I can curl 50 pounds. That's my max. I wouldn't max a bicep curl, but let's just go with it. So I grab a 5-pound weight. So I already know I can do this. My bicep isn't going to activate all of my muscle fibers to get that 5 pounds up. It's only going to activate what it needs to in order to complete the movement, or what it thinks it needs to complete the movement. Okay. So that, if you can see this guy squatting, he's squatting lighter weight. So in this case, type 1s are only being used because they're the lowest force producers. You don't need to use the energy to produce all the other force because you can already overcome it because you have enough of those fibers, or the size of those fibers. Does that kind of make sense? Then you have rate coding. So this is how quickly the rate of those motor units are being activated. Okay. So again, that signal, the faster it is, the more contractions you're going, or the more minimal contractions you're going to have. Right. So sometimes you need a lot of that signal, right? Strong signal to get everything going together, or a weaker signal because you're able to overcome it. And then you have what's called the size principles, or the order of activation. So type 1 to type 2A to type 2X or type 2B, right? So you're working through that as you go. Now, so you'll use all your muscle fibers, right? And if you get to a point of failure, what that failure means is you actually, even if it's 5 pounds, so let's say I kept doing 5 pounds and I kept going and I kept going and I kept going and I was doing 50 reps, whatever it is, eventually I am going to have to kick into type 2A and type 2X because now the force, I do need to overcome that force. And so I do need to use all of my fibers. Now, is it the most ideal in training those type 2 fibers? I would say no, but just understand that when you get to failure, your body has tried everything it can. It's not like, oh, I had type 2X left, right? It went through the ringer to get through those reps with whatever your exercise is. So just understanding that kind of as we go. That's why maybe set 1 is a little bit easier than set 3, or rep 1 is easier than rep 20. Okay. So just understand why that's happening. It's because of these types of gradations or increases in force. Skeletal system. So again, basics of this, again, muscles are a big thing, but you need to know what the muscles are acting on. I think that's important, right? So muscles act on bones, and the bones are at meeting at joints. So you're actually manipulating the joints is the idea, the gap between two bones, right? So again, bicep joint is here. That's what we're manipulating. If there was no movement there, then we wouldn't be doing any type of movement. I can do a raise. Right now I'm working the shoulder joint. If I go to the side, right, we're working the neck and cervical spine and things like that. So again, movement, what is it? Skeletal system for? So movement, mineral storage, right? Calcium, phosphorus, things like that, potassium. Red blood cells, right, are made in your marrow. And then if you think about your rib cage protecting your organs, right? Your heart is under there, your lungs are there, most of your organs are under there, your diaphragm, things like that. How it's organized. So we can think of the axial skeleton. So that's your skull, vertebrae, sternum, and ribs. So think that middle section, right? That is your axis. You're going to be sitting on that. And then you have your appendages, or your appendicular skeleton, which is your upper and lower limbs. So again, axial is going to be here. And then your appendicular is going to be your limbs on the side. And again, understanding basic bones is going to be important. I hope you would learn that. I don't need you to know the markings or wherever origins and insertions and things like that. You should know what origins and insertions are, just where muscles attach. But I'm not going to quiz you on those. If you're still in classes and you take anatomy, I'm sure you've gotten plenty of that. Kind of a why, a real important thing. So with bones, so osteoporosis and exercise, bones go under remodeling. So when we talk about developing like bone mineral density, that's one of the positive adaptations of exercise, resistance training. You're building up bone because they want to be able to resist more of that force because you put a stress on them. So osteoclasts are breakdown, and then osteoblasts are building. I know that might sound opposite. So osteoblasts, we want those building muscle. We want those developing stronger muscles. If you don't do that, you eventually get bone breakdown. And so you get things like osteoporosis. It's not just for old people. It tends to happen in them more often, but we want to try to resist that as much as possible. And then, so what are some causes? Nutrition's one, and then lack of exercise. Again, resistance training increases that bone mineral density. So if you're working with older clientele, they might've been told they have osteoporosis or weak bones or weak joints. This is something, as scary as it might be, proper programming of resistance training can be great for them eventually developing stronger bones and joints. So if you need a why, or you're in this situation, I think this is one of those great adaptations and reasons why. And then tendons and ligaments. So tendons attach muscle to bone. Ligaments are bone to bone. So Tendon, think like the white part. If you've ever seen a picture of a muscle, the white part at the end of a muscle that attaches. So if we take the bicep, right, the bicep's usually red, and then you eventually get some white stuff that's going to be attaching up at the shoulder. So that would be a tendon. And then if you think about the knee and like ACLs and MCLs and things like that, that's all connecting all those leg bones together, bone to bone. So that would be different than a tendon. So you don't usually, if you're going to tear your ACL, it's not a tendon you tore, it's a ligament. Sometimes, and so again, they're going to be more around joints, where tendons are going to be that muscle to bone area. So just again, understanding the difference between those two. So there's a couple of discussions here. Again, if I was in class with you, they would be up there. I already post different discussions for you guys in this class. But again, just thinking about different exercises and your reliance on fiber types. Think about which ones would be more type 1, which ones would be more type 2, and why is that? And then again, muscle spindle and Golgi tendon organ, make sure you can explain the difference between those two, whether you say that to yourself right now, or you grab a friend and you go, hey, let me tell you about the difference between these. Again, the way you know if you understand something is if you can explain it to somebody. If you can't, then there might be some misreading there. And so it's important to do that. So I hope that you guys understand those things. And then these are just some review questions. You guys can look at these on your own, and then I have the answers at the end of them. So if you want to give yourself a quiz, work through the PowerPoint and go through those. But that is chapter 1. And I'll stop sharing my screen right there. But hopefully that makes sense. And then I'll get chapter 2 in for you guys really soon.